Hey, old man, you're making the place look bad. The words landed hard, sharp, public. The man in the corner didn't move. He just looked up, boots dusty jacket, faded eyes steady. He didn't argue, didn't explain. He reached for his cap, laid a $10 bill on the counter, and walked out. No one stopped him. No one stood up. But the next morning, everything changed. The bar door creaked open. 6 men walked in silent and deliberate. No uniforms, no introductions. Just presence. One placed a folded American flag on the counter. Another set down a worn photo. 7 soldiers shoulder to shoulder, sun in their eyes, grit on their faces. Then a voice, quiet but cold, filled the room. You threw out the man who carried half this team through hell. And suddenly, silence meant more than words ever could. There's a little house on the edge of Port Wells, Maine, 2 rooms, a rusted chimney, and a white fence that's seen better years. It's not much to look at, especially with the Atlantic wind peeling the paint from the porch rails. But if you pass by around sunrise, you might catch the smell of fresh cedar shavings or the soft rumble of an old table saw humming inside. That's where Elliot Granger lives. He's 72, give or take a year, depending on which season you ask him. Most people in town don't know the full of it. Just that he showed up one winter about 15 years ago, bought the old Harrington place, and quietly turned it into a functioning little workshop with nothing but his bare hands and a truck that sounds like it's gasping for retirement. The man himself is built like someone who's weathered more than a few storms, lean shoulders, hands like thick leather gloves, and a jaw that looks like it hasn't had much use for small talk in decades. His hair's mostly gone, his beard stays trimmed out of habit, and his eyes, well, they don't dart around like most folks. They just hold, steady, like someone who learned long ago the value of silence. The newcomers just call him Mr. Granger or that old guy with the oil can. But the lifers, the ones who've lived in Port Wells since back when the cannery still ran full tilt, they know a bit more. Bits and pieces. They know he was with SEAL Team 3, that he did recon in the Gulf, that somewhere between 81 and 92, he was part of a rescue op in Beirut that pulled out 6 civilians from a collapsed hotel using only a hand signal in a tunnel full of fire. But they also know he never talks about any of it. Elliot doesn't tell stories. He fixes things. Broken fence posts, faulty wiring, cold furnaces in the middle of February. He doesn't charge much. And if you're a widow or a single mother or just someone down on their luck, he'll pretend like you paid him with coffee and a sandwich. Every Monday and Wednesday, he teaches auto shop at the Port Wells Youth Center. He's not on the payroll, he just shows up. Teaches the kids how to change brake lines, read a voltmeter, and most importantly, how not to panic when something sparks. The boys listen because he doesn't shout. He just knows. And the girls appreciate that he doesn't talk down to them like most of the men in town do. But it's what he does on Fridays that folks have quietly learned not to question. Every Friday at exactly 4:45 p.m., Elliot walks 3 blocks down to Miller's Tap Room. It's a simple bar, hardwood floors, a chalkboard menu, and the smell of old whiskey soaked into the grain of the walls. He always takes the same booth near the window but far from the jukebox. Always orders a bourbon neat. Never asks for the TV to be turned down even when it blares college football or some local news bit no one really listens to. He sips slowly and folds a piece of paper from his inside coat pocket. No one's ever asked what's on it. But once a waitress, new girl named Josie, walked by close enough to glimpse the words. She said it was just names. Handwritten. 7 of them. No titles, no dates, just names. He reads them quietly to himself, then folds the paper back up like it's something sacred. And for that 1 hour, Elliot Granger is somewhere else. Maybe back in a jungle with a radio that barely works. Maybe lying prone on a rooftop under moonlight with only the sound of his breath to keep time. Maybe dragging someone heavier than himself through sand and shrapnel while everything behind him burned. Or maybe he's just sitting with the ghosts of men no one else remembers but him. The regulars have come to understand this is not a man to interrupt. No birthday toasts, no high fives, no, what's your story, old-timer kind of talk. They don't know what he's seen, but they know something shaped him. And so every Friday, the corner booth is unofficially his. Even when it's crowded, even when there's a line. No one sits there. No one touches his glass. Because sometimes respect isn't loud. It's just a quiet seat in the corner, waiting for a man who shows up not to drink, but to remember. And maybe that's what Elliot Granger has been doing all along. Not trying to move on, not trying to forget, just showing up. So they aren't forgotten. It had been 2 weeks since the bar changed hands. At first, the regulars didn't notice much as same stools, same dusty dartboard, same clatter of pint glasses behind the counter. But subtle shifts began to creep in. The old jukebox that played Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash was unplugged one morning. In its place came a Bluetooth speaker that pulsed low synth beats most folks didn't recognize. The chalkboard menu was replaced with laminated cocktail lists, spiced maple old-fashioned, coastal basil mule, and a drink served in a jar with a rosemary twig poking out like it had wandered in from the florist. Then came the polished uniforms. The new bartenders, all fresh-faced and branded with matching Miller's taproom polos, had been trained not to pour unless there was a card on the bar first. They didn't know who Elliot Granger was. They barely knew the town. But Colin Miller did. He was born here, after all. The son of Frank Miller, the man who'd run the taproom for 34 years before a stroke sent him into early retirement. Frank had built this place the old way, sawdust on the floor, during fishing season free rounds on Veterans Day, and enough loyalty to fill a ship's logbook. But Colin didn't inherit his father's patience, only the deed and the ambition. At 28, Colin had returned to Port Wells after spending 8 years in Portland's startup scene. He had plans, a rebrand, a cocktail crowd. He wanted to turn Miller's into something trendy enough for travel blogs, but local enough to still wear its name. There wasn't room in that plan for dusty coats, old boots, and war stories soaked in bourbon. So when Elliot Granger walked in on his usual Friday just before 5 and made his way to the corner booth, like he always did, Colin noticed. And he didn't like it. The old man wasn't exactly blending in, wearing the same faded field jacket, the same scuffed leather boots, the same cap that looked like it had traveled more countries than Colin had apps on his phone. Colin watched him quietly from behind the bar at first, arms crossed, watched him unfold the same piece of paper, watched him sip slowly, not speaking to anyone, not reacting to the music, not engaging with the new energy the bar had been trying to create. To Colin, it wasn't respect. It was resistance. So he made his way down the bar, clapping a towel in one hand, and came to a stop at the corner booth. The conversation in the bar didn't stop, but it slowed, just enough that people began turning their heads. Colin leaned in, speaking loudly enough for nearby patrons to hear. "This isn't a shelter, old man. Take your cheap whiskey and leave." There was no venom in Elliot's eyes, no defense. He simply folded the paper again, slower this time, like it meant something. Then he reached inside his jacket, pulled out a $10 bill, creased precise, and placed it gently on the table beside the half-finished glass. He picked up his cap, stood, and walked out. No words, no protest, just the sound of boots on hardwood and a door swinging closed behind him. Colin stood there for a moment as if expecting applause. It didn't come. A couple near the dartboard shifted uncomfortably. The old bartender Reggie froze mid-glass, wiped his jaw, clenched but silent. A young waitress who just started the week before looked down at her shoes, clearly unsure of what she'd just witnessed, but knowing it didn't feel right. But no one said anything. Not yet. Colin turned, shrugged to himself, and muttered, "Guy thinks this place is still a VFW hall." And just like that, Elliot was gone. Gone from the bar he'd walked into every week for years. Gone from the corner booth that had silently become his. Gone from the conversations that would now carry his absence more heavily than his presence ever did. Outside, the wind pushed salt through the air from the docks. Elliot didn't look back. He didn't need to. Inside, something had shifted, not loudly, but deeply. The kind of shift that comes not with outrage, but with regret. Reggie, still holding the same glass, finally set it down, wiped the counter where Elliot's drink had been. Then, without a word, he gently picked up the $10 bill and slid it into the tip jar. He always paid first, he said quietly to no one in particular. Never asked for more than he used. The bar didn't clap back. It didn't erupt. It didn't argue. It just hushed. And in the corner, the booth sat empty, half shadowed by the dimming sunlight, and somehow louder than anything else in the room. The morning air carried a damp chill thick with sea salt and the low hum of gulls circling the docks. Most of Port Wells was still tucked inside, sipping coffee, reading the paper, or waiting for the kettle to whistle. But the staff at Miller's tap room was already inside, sweeping the floors and prepping for the weekend brunch rush. Colin Miller was behind the bar again, sleeves rolled, eyes tired but satisfied. He hadn't slept much, but he didn't care. To him, he'd taken a necessary step the night before, resetting the tone of his father's bar. Old-timers had to make way for the new crowd. You don't modernize by clinging to dusty rituals and silent ghosts. The moment stayed with him only for a few minutes, until 9:02 a.m. The front door creaked open, not swung, not pushed, creaked like something deliberate, ceremonial. Everyone inside turned. 6 men stepped into the bar, silent, steady. No uniforms, no insignias. Just dark jackets, weathered jeans, and a kind of weight that didn't need introduction. They weren't loud, they didn't smile, but every inch of them, posture, gaze, gait, radiated discipline. Brotherhood, history. Colin glanced up, blinking like he didn't quite believe what he was seeing. He looked toward Reggie, but the old bartender just stood still, glass in hand, face unreadable. The man in front, broad shoulders, salt and pepper hair, eyes hard as glass, walked to the counter without a word. In his hands was a small wooden picture frame, old and worn, the kind you didn't buy at a store. He placed it gently on the counter. 7 men stood in the photo, dressed in desert gear, arms slung around each other, dust clinging to their faces like memory. Right in the center, Elliot Granger, younger but unmistakable eyes, focused jaw, clenched, half a smile barely forming. The rest of the team was a blur of sun fatigue and brotherhood. Another man stepped forward and set down a folded American flag. Sharp corners, perfectly creased, worn at the edges but still unmistakably pristine in its reverence. The flag touched the counter like it belonged there. No one in the bar moved. No one dared. Colin tried to gather himself. I'm sorry, is there something I can help you fellas with?" The first man looked him in the eye, then spoke low, calm, cold. "You threw out the man who carried half this team through hell." The words were louder than the tone. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth had its own volume. Colin swallowed. I didn't know who he was." The third man stepped forward. His knuckles bore scars. His stare didn't waver. "Exactly. You never asked." A silence heavier than anything filled the room. You could hear the low buzz of the bar's neon sign. Even the wind outside seemed to stop and listen. From a stool in the back, an older customer slowly stood and removed his cap. Near the jukebox, a teenage employee named Theo Martinez stepped forward. In his hand, a phone still gripped loosely. Screen dimmed. He looked nervous but resolved. "I recorded it," he said, eyes on Colin. "I didn't know why at first, but when I got home, I showed it to my dad." The SEALs turned toward him. Theo took a breath. "My dad served with Elliot, said he owed his life to that man." One of the SEALs, older, grayer, limping slightly, nodded slowly. "We all do." From the back entrance came a sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, a cane tapping wood. Frank Miller, Colin's father, entered, his face pale, older than the stroke had made him. He paused when he saw the flag, then the photo, then he looked at his son. "You embarrassed this place," he said, voice strained but steady. "Now fix it." Colin's shoulders collapsed an inch. The air seemed to press on his chest. One of the SEALs approached gently, not with threat, with something deeper. "We're not here to humiliate you," he said. "We came to honor the man you forgot to see." No one moved for a long moment. Then one of the men walked to a blank wall between sports posters and tapped it with his knuckle. Another followed, pulling a small shadow box from his coat inside the folded flag, now placed gently in a wooden frame. The photo went up beside it. Quiet hands worked together, deliberate, efficient, like they'd done it before under worse circumstances. Above it, a plaque was screwed into the wood. "Elliot Granger, SEAL Team 3. Quiet Valor." Theo stood nearby watching. His voice cracked a little. "Last night you treated him like no one. But that man saved my father in Kandahar, and that deserves more than silence." The SEAL with the scar above his eye turned to Colin one last time. "He may never walk through this door again." But the question is, will this ever be the kind of place he'd want to? They didn't stay for drinks, didn't wait for applause. They turned, walked out the way they came, silent, unified. But they left something behind, a bar transformed, a town awoken, and a question that would echo long after the door closed behind them. By noon, the video had already started circulating. Theo Martinez had posted it to a private Facebook group for veterans his father's old unit. He didn't add music, didn't caption it with anything flashy. Just a 32-second clip, 6 men walking into a bar, placing a folded flag and a photo on the counter, and one sentence that seemed to knock the breath out of everyone who heard it. You threw out the man who carried half this team through hell. No shouting, no violence, just presence and silence. Within 2 hours, the video had 12,000 shares. By dinner time, it was on Reddit labeled, "When the Quiet Ones Are the Legends." That same night, a small-town news station picked it up, tagging it, "Veterans stand up for one of their own in the most dignified way possible." But back in Port Wells, the shift wasn't digital. It was real. Across town, the mood had changed. At the local post office, Helen Drake, who'd worked the front desk for 22 years, left a small bouquet at the base of the bar's door. "He helped me rewire my porch light after my husband passed. Didn't charge me a thing," she told the mail carrier. "Didn't even take a cookie." At Lincoln Middle School, Mr. Halverson, an old civics teacher and retired Army reservist, brought the story into his ethics class. He printed the transcript of Elliot's story and asked his students to reflect. He titled the blackboard in capital letters, "Dignity Isn't Always Loud." One student wrote, "Respect doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from how someone shows up when no one's watching." Another, "I want to be the kind of person who notices others even when no one else does." The message spread without anyone telling it to. The next Friday, something strange happened. Elliot didn't show up at his usual hour, but his seat wasn't empty. Instead, someone had placed a small note card on the table in neat handwriting, "Reserved for Mr. Granger," and next to it a glass of water, untouched, still, waiting. Around 6:00 p.m., people began arriving at Miller's not for cocktails but to watch. A young mother with a toddler, a Coast Guard vet with an old limp and a thick beard. Even teenagers who normally hung out behind the gas station showed up, hoods off, voices lowered. They weren't there to drink. They came to see if he'd return, to be there if he did. And then he did. At 6:12, the door creaked open. Elliot stepped inside, the same field jacket over his shoulders, cap in hand. He didn't look angry. He didn't look surprised. Just steady. The room didn't clap. It didn't rise. But every head turned. Every conversation paused. The only sound was the low hum of the neon sign and the soft creak of wood under his boots. He walked to his table, saw the note and the water, paused, then sat down. Reggie behind the bar poured a bourbon. Didn't ask. Just poured. Then walked it over himself and set it beside the water. "This one's on the house," he said. Elliot nodded once quietly and placed a folded 10 on the napkin anyway. The silence held for a long moment. Then it softened into low conversation, gentle music, a kind of respectful quiet that isn't forced, it's felt. From the corner, Theo approached, hesitant, hands in his hoodie pocket. "Sir," he said, voice low, "I didn't mean to put you on display. I thought people should know." Elliot looked up at him. There was no resentment, no irritation, just a small, tired smile. Sometimes they need reminding. That weekend, the community did more than watch. They acted. Colin Miller, still rattled by the storm he never meant to start, called for a town meeting at the VFW hall. Dozens showed up, not to argue, but to plan. A retired carpenter offered to build a display case. The mayor offered a commemorative plaque. A high school art teacher sketched a mural concept for the bar's west wall, 7 silhouettes in desert sun, one in the center with no name. They called the movement "One Flag, One Table." Every last Friday of the month, that table would stay empty. A folded flag would rest on it, and anyone, veteran or civilian, could sit beside it in silence, in memory and thanks. No speeches, no microphones, just presence. It wasn't long before other towns caught on. The video went national. Elliot's face appeared in headlines he never saw because he never tried to. He didn't use social media, didn't own a TV, and if anyone tried to thank him too publicly, he'd nod politely and change the subject. But the town changed around him. Young boys saluted him at the grocery store. A local church gave him a key to the old community workshop. Students wrote essays about him without ever hearing his full story. And still every Friday, Elliot returned to Miller's. Same table, same drink, same paper folded quietly in his coat. He never read it out loud. But by now, everyone in town understood those names were not just a list. They were his reason. It didn't happen all at once. Change rarely does. But in the weeks that followed, something subtle and steady began to shape Miller's taproom. Not just the bar, but what it stood for. The first thing to go was the cocktail menu. Colin Miller took it down himself, folded it, and filed it away. He didn't throw it out. He wasn't trying to erase what he'd tried to build, just trying to understand what had always been here before he arrived. Then came the tribute wall. Reggie, the bartender, who'd seen more years behind the counter than some of the patrons had been alive, cleared out the stretch of wood paneling near the front windows. He wiped it down, hung fresh lighting, and mounted a glass case in the center. Inside the folded flag, the same one that had been placed on the counter that morning. Beside it, a photo of SEAL Team 3, 7 men under desert sun, arm in arm, sand in their teeth, smiles in their eyes. In front of the case was a plaque carved from oak, the kind that catches light softly, like it holds something sacred. Elliot Granger, SEAL Team 3. Quiet valor. But Colin didn't stop there. He worked with local veterans to expand the tribute wall. Not with medals, not with ranks. Just with names and photos, black and white portraits, handwritten notes from families, snapshots of young men and women in uniform framed without fanfare. At the center of it all, a single empty chair beneath a sign that simply read, "Seat for the Silent Ones." It didn't take long before others followed. A boy from the high school art class donated a painting he'd made after watching the viral clip. It showed a man sitting alone at a bar table, but instead of shadows, the space behind him was filled with the faint silhouettes of 6 others, standing tall, unseen by the world, but never absent. Colin mounted the painting on the back wall opposite the booth where Elliot always sat. And that booth, it became something sacred too. Every Friday night without fail, that table was cleaned first. A glass of bourbon was placed at 4:45 p.m., even if Elliot hadn't arrived yet. The napkin folded twice, a $10 bill tucked beneath it. Elliot never once asked for this, but the town didn't do it for thanks. They did it because they'd seen something rare. When Elliot finally did speak publicly, it wasn't in a speech. It wasn't even through a microphone. It was during the first One Flag, One Table event. The place was packed, but no one was talking loudly. No one laughed over the music. There was a kind of reverence in the air, like people had come not to be entertained, but to be reminded. Colin had offered him the mic. Elliot shook his head. Instead, he stood beside the table, looked around, cap in hand, then said only this: "I'm not here to be praised. I'm just here so no other vet has to sit in silence again." And that was it. No applause, just stillness. Then one by one, people rose to their feet, not in noise, but in respect. Word of what was happening in Port Wells spread. Quietly, the way all important things tend to. Other bars adopted the one flag tradition. Some sent folded flags of their own to Miller's. A few Vietnam vets drove across state lines just to sit at Elliot's table, not to talk, but to be near someone who carried what they carried. One night, a young Marine home from deployment walked in, still in civvies, still carrying something heavy in his shoulders. He didn't say much, just nodded at Elliot, then asked if he could sit across from him. Elliot slid the second glass across the table without a word. They didn't speak for almost 30 minutes. But by the time the Marine stood, his eyes had softened. He left behind his unit patch folded carefully and placed it beside the bourbon glass. That patch still rests in the corner of the tribute wall. For the people of Port Wells, Elliot Granger had become more than just a veteran. He had become a symbol of endurance, humility, and dignity so quiet it didn't need defense. He still fixed furnaces, still taught the teens at the community garage, still walked to the bar every Friday in the same jacket and boots. He didn't change, but everything around him did. People began greeting each other differently, listening longer, noticing the quiet ones more often. And maybe that's the legacy Elliot never meant to leave, but did anyway. Not because he shouted, not because he demanded recognition, but because he showed up even when no one was watching. On the 1-year anniversary of the night, he was told to leave a new plaque was added to the wall. He didn't ask for justice. He reminded us what it looked like. It wasn't signed. Didn't need to be. Everyone already knew whose story it told. They never called him a hero. Not in headlines, not in speeches, and certainly not in Miller's taproom, because Elliot Granger never wanted to be called anything at all. He just kept showing up, quietly, steadily, without fail. Every Friday before sunset, he would walk through the town that had learned to see him, past the post office where the clerk would nod and say, "Evening, Mr. G," past the hardware store where someone always held the door, past the children's mural on the side of the youth center where someone had painted his boots beneath a tree, no face, just presence, and then to the bar. Same corner, same seat, same paper folded in his pocket. Only now he wasn't alone. Sometimes it was a young man who'd lost a brother in the sandbox. Sometimes it was a daughter who never knew why her father woke up screaming. Sometimes it was just a stranger who had nothing to say, but knew they had to sit there anyway. And Elliot always made room, never asked questions, never gave advice, just listened, or let the silence do it for him, because he understood what few do, that some stories don't need to be told to be understood. They just need to be witnessed. He never changed much, never got used to people recognizing him, never accepted discounts, awards, or tributes. But in his quiet way, he left a kind of blueprint behind, not just for Port Wells, but for anyone who's ever overlooked the old man in the corner. Anyone who's ever forgotten that some strength doesn't wear ribbons. It wears dust and silence and dignity that refuses to be loud. The bar still stands today. The tribute wall has grown. The bourbon glass still waits every Friday, and the chair across from Elliot is never truly empty. Even on the days when no one sits there, you can feel the weight of those who once did, and the ghosts who still do. Because legends don't always speak. Sometimes they just sit. And in that quiet, we learn to listen. In a world that moves faster every day, where headlines shout and voices compete to be the loudest, maybe it's time we learn to value the quiet ones again. Men like Elliot Granger don't ask for applause. They don't trend. They don't demand your attention. But they carry the weight of what matters most: honor, sacrifice, and the kind of strength that lives in action, not words. How many Elliots have we walked past? How many stories have we missed because we didn't ask or didn't see? In today's America, where generations often feel divided and veterans too often feel forgotten, perhaps this story reminds us of something simple: that dignity isn't loud, respect doesn't retire, and silence can speak volumes. Maybe the question isn't, why didn't Elliot say anything? Maybe the question is, would we have listened if he did? So now we ask you, have you ever known someone like Elliot? Someone who never talked about what they did but changed your life anyway? Do you believe we've lost the habit of honoring quiet strength in today's culture? Should more public spaces, bars, schools, town halls create their own seat for the silent ones? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one. If this story moved you, comment respect for those who served quietly. Tag someone who carries dignity without needing a spotlight, or share a story of someone in your life who reminds you of Elliot. And if you'd like to hear more stories that honor the silent heroes among us, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a moment that matters. Because sometimes one name, one flag, one empty chair can teach us more than 100 speeches ever will. Thank you for spending your time with us today. And wherever you are, whether in a small town, a big city, or just a quiet booth in the corner, we hope you always remember true strength doesn't need to speak. It just needs to be seen.